Today we're going to talk about the first apocalypse of James. So, for those of you who don't know already, the first apocalypse of James is an early Christian Gnostic revelation. It is part of the large corpus of New Testament apocrypha, which is a set of writings that did not gain acceptance in most churches during the formation of the canon in late antiquity. In other words, the apocrypha are a group of writings that were not accepted by the mainstream Catholic and Orthodox churches in the centuries following the life of Jesus. It presents a secret discussion between Jesus and his brother James, in which Jesus explains James' ultimate fate and how to achieve salvation. This presentation will give an overview and commentary of the text, although not every detail will be covered, because it is a very dense text and it is very difficult to summarize in a quick video, which is really why I'm doing a separate video just on the content instead of including the secondary scholarship and that sort of thing. I'm going to talk about that in a separate video, so I hope that you will bear with me and patiently await the second installment of this little series. So, let's give a little bit of an outline of the narrative. This apocryphal revelation has roughly 3 parts. 1. Jesus converses with James before the crucifixion. 2. Jesus converses with James after the crucifixion. And 3. James goes to his earthly fate, which of course he's killed violently by the Jews. So those are the 3 parts of this little text. And so now let's go into some of the content now that you know the outline that it has. So the first part, of course, is Jesus' first conversation with James. The text opens up like this. Jesus says to James, "See now the completion of my redemption. I have given you a sign of these things, James, my brother. For not without reason have I called you my brother, although you are not my brother materially." So the gospel starts after a fashion in the form of what we call in medias res, right? In the middle of things, in the middle of the action. Jesus is walking around with James, and he decides to say to James, hey, it's almost time for my redemption to be complete, and you are my brother, James, but I call you my brother, even though you're not my brother in a physical sense. So as we can see, curiously, Jesus affirms his relationship with James, or his earthly relationship with James, while qualifying it by saying that it is not a physical relationship. He's not literally or materially the brother of Jesus. So why is this? Maybe there's some kind of docetism or some kind of idea that Christ wasn't really a human being in this text, because some early Christians thought that Jesus was more of a ghost or a phantom or something, which means that he wouldn't literally have had brothers like James, who is known as the brother of the Lord, the brother of Jesus. So anyway, that's an interesting question that we can talk about later. But anyway, the conversation continues in which Jesus explains the theology, the true theology to James. So Jesus says that he comes from a being called Him Who Is, the one that existed when nothing else did. So this might classically be speaking the being that is the first cause of everything else. So Jesus says that he is an image of this being, and Jesus' job is to help others ascend through 72 heavens, specifically it's 72, to be reunited with this being. And Jesus discusses this in a very lengthy manner with James, with his brother James, and it's a very interesting discussion. So after this discussion, Jesus says that it is important to overcome ignorance with knowledge. But after he talks about this, Jesus says farewell to James, and then he fulfilled what was fitting. So what this means is that Jesus went along and he went to be crucified and fulfilled his purpose on earth. So the text doesn't narrate the crucifixion and the resurrection. This is interesting because the canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, do narrate at length the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. But this particular apocalypse of James, the first apocalypse of James, does not narrate the crucifixion and resurrection at all. These events are merely implied in the text. But during these things, James is grieving because he knows that Jesus has suffered. But he's also upset because Jesus predicted James's later suffering in this first conversation. He said that James was going to go through a bad string of events just like Jesus does. So the text goes on to say, when James heard of his suffering and was much distressed, they awaited the sign of his coming. And he came after several days, meaning Jesus. Jesus came after several days. And James was walking upon the mountain, which is called Galgalon, with his disciples. So I'm very curious here whether these disciples are actually James's disciples or Jesus's disciples. Of course, you can see that there's a pronoun here being used instead of a proper name, so it's not very clear to me from the text which is the case. But we can see that this apocalyptic text is framing the scene that's set between the two conversations with Jesus. The first conversation with Jesus is over. Jesus has died. James is sad. The disciples are sad, and they are walking around around the mountain. And that's when Jesus shows up, and the second conversation takes place. So what was this second conversation? Jesus then appears to them and gives a lengthy mythical account of the layers of the heavens and how to ascend beyond them. He refers to the famous Gnostic idea that the female escort of the highest deity produced beings, or continually produce, I think it should be the past tense. They produce beings without intercourse with the husband, with the male deity. So this female deity is called Achamoth and Sophia in the text. And those of you who are familiar with Gnosticism know very well that Sophia is supposed to be this female goddess who is the wisdom, literally. The Greek word for wisdom is Sophia. That this female deity is the wisdom of the highest God. But this wisdom of the highest God gives birth to chains of divine beings because she conceives beings without having intercourse with the male deity. But anyway, after all this deep Gnostic theology is discussed between Jesus and James, the text goes on to ground its authority in connections with apostles such as James as well as other apostles. And if you know much about early Christian literature, one of the important things that early Christians did to give authority to their texts was to associate them with different apostles by claiming that either the apostle wrote it or it's a record of something that the apostle received from Jesus directly, or however it may be. But this is a very important motif. So Jesus tells James the Just, of course that's his name, James the Just, the brother of the Lord. Jesus says to keep these things secret, but to tell them only to the disciple named Addai, who is supposed to write these things down 10 years after the war in Jerusalem. Jesus says there will be a war in Jerusalem. James, hang on to the secrets until 10 years after the war in Jerusalem, and tell them to Addai, who's this disciple that I think is associated with Thaddeus, who's supposed to be just another name of Thaddeus. But anyway, what is this war that Jesus is talking about? I just assume that it is the Jewish War of 67 through 73 A.D. This was the war that resulted in the final Roman conquest of the Jews and the dispersion of the Jews across all the lands of Europe and Africa and elsewhere. So anyway, as an aside, I think that because this text is written from the perspective of a third person instead of in James's voice, I think that Addai is presumably supposed to be the author and the narrator of this story, just because of this reference in which Jesus says that Addai is supposed to write these down. Now, why he tells Addai to write them down instead of James, I'm not totally sure, but it could be just the fact that this text wants to draw from the authority both of James and of Addai. So if you take one as the fellow who got the revelation and the other guy as the one who wrote it down, you can gain authority from both figures. So after this, the text has many holes in this point. But Jesus says to James, James, behold, I shall reveal to you your redemption. When you are seized, and you undergo these sufferings, a multitude will arm themselves against you. James must take courage because this will help others to be saved. And we know the rest is history, because James eventually got in trouble with the high priest in Jerusalem. And James was sentenced, according to the reports, to be killed by stoning, which is the classic Jewish way to get killed if you violate the law or commit blasphemy or something like that. So there's just one more part of the text. This is the third part of the text, which is a short reference to James's death. And you can see I took out the excerpt right here, but there's really not much content left over. There are lots of gaps in the text. You can see it says, and the majority of them, when they saw the messenger took in, the others said, him from this earth, for he is not worthy of life. These then were afraid. They arose, saying, we have no part in this blood, for a just man will perish through injustice. And James departed, so that, look for we him. Again, I think this we refers to Thaddeus narrating the story from his own perspective. But clearly the story seems to be showing that James gets killed. And if you fill in the blanks, then that seems to make perfect sense. But anyway, that's all we have for our discussion of the content of the first apocalypse of James. I hope that you'll stay tuned for later when we bring in a video that talks about the manuscript evidence, the provenance, the scholarly issues, and the historical questions surrounding this text. But in any case, I hope that you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you next time.